All right, welcome to the review recap of China, and we're going to go over some of the dynasties: the Shang, the Zhou, and the Qing. We're also going to have a bonus dynasty, the Han, and we'll even talk a little bit about the Shia, which we know was most likely not real. If you're looking at your China overview, which is the brief history and outline, it starts talking about the geography of China and the early China, and it still is today, larger than the United States. It has a varied climate. Parts of it are very cold. Up in the mountains, the northern part of China, it's very cold. But you also have very hot parts too, the subtropical south. Uh, we've talked about the Yellow River or the Huanghe and the Yangtze in central China. This is where the earliest of the civilizations sprang up in China. And if you go all the way back into, like 4000 BC or so, it was said that there was a dynasty that came up during the Huanghe River, and that was called the Xia, and most likely a mythical dynasty and not actually real. What is a dynasty? According to your notes here, dynasty is a series of rulers from the same family, and we've looked at several different dynasties. And you really want to have your children maintain that dynasty. We're going to look at the dynastic cycle and how dynasties rise, they become powerful, they take power, they rule for a while, they rule well, and then things start to go bad, and you have rebellions and disasters, and then the downward spiral. The emperor loses the so-called mandate of heaven, and a civil war comes about, and there are people from all sides fighting until one major dynasty emerges, and they claim they have the mandate of heaven. Um, and then they rule the same way for a while. If we look at the first dynasty, we see that it's the Shang, and they come up with China's first writing system, which is over 2,000 symbols. You see a picture right here. These are your oracle bones, and it shows early Chinese writing where they ask the gods their questions. Over here it shows some of the bronze that was used during this time period. Um, Soldiers developed war chariots and powerful bows and bronze armor, very similar to what was going on in Egypt. They also invented a calendar based on the cycles of the moon, so that we know that the moon goes through 30 day cycles, and so their calendar would be 12 months of 30 days, which leaves them a little bit short. Leaves them a little bit short, so not sure what they did with those extra 5 days. All right, as the Shangs begins to crumble, the Zhou come to power, and they're going to rule for around 400 years. They basically came in from northern China. They invade the Huanghe River Valley. They claim that the Shang had lost the mandate of heaven and described what that was. That, it was the gods giving them their approval. And they also claimed that China itself belonged to the emperor, and everyone must be loyal to him. This was also a time period where they began using feudalism, giving land exchange for military service. So you get the nobles start to rise in China at this time period. And we see here below the lords were peasants. Peasants had to grow their own food. They had to grow food for the lords. Each part of China was given to these different lords, and in return, the lords stayed loyal to the emperor and gave him military service, defended him, put down rebellions, and such. And this was the beginning of feudalism in China. We also know that Confucius came about during this time period. He lived during this time period, and Lao Tzu came about during this time period, and again, they had very different views that we know, and we got into those with the different philosophies. Eventually, we know that during the time of Confucius, things began to crumble. They got bad. There were uprisings. There were rebellions, there was a lot of crime and natural disasters, and eventually the emperor was overthrown, and China, as you can see, broke into these many different warring kingdoms. Hey, look, it's the Qin, the Wu, the Zhao, the Yan, all right, the Lu, the Zhao, the Song, the Chu, the Shu, all right, all these different places, and these were like, this is like feudalism. Each dynasty, each lord controls his own land and begins to try to fight with other lords for control. And eventually we know this lord is going to emerge victorious and unite all of China under the Qin. The Qin dynasty, if you notice, 15 years is not a very long time to rule, but he does add or completely take over all of this area right here. So he unites all of those warring, these were all warring and divided China up. Shi Huangdi is going to unify all of China under his control. Very strict ruler. Legalism comes about during this time period. Strict military dictatorship. Dictator is one who rules all and doesn't have anybody question his authority. He like stands on top. He crushes all that oppose him. And so this is a time period where China is united and not divided. He destroys the nobles' feudal power, so the lords lose their rights and privileges that they had before. He moves all of those, let's go back here, all of these dynasty leaders, all of these lords have to move to the capital and live in the capital so he can keep them under close guard. All right. Expanded China both north and south and begins construction on the Great Wall of China, 1,500 miles of the Great Wall of China. And a lot of it is just connecting walls that had already been built and connecting them in places like where mountains were and going over the top of these so that it will create some sort of a barrier that we know that it didn't keep people out, but it still symbolizes the strength and ethnocentricity of China. Shi Huangdi, there he is. That's a pretty sweet picture I found online. It's probably not a true depiction, but I just thought it looked really cool. There are his terracotta soldiers that you saw in the video that guarded his tomb. Unified law code, unified the language. He put in his own officials so he could rule efficiently like a dictator. Again, the Great Wall was being built during his time period, ruled using legalism, censored all anti-government material. That's what legalists do. Outlawed Confucianism because Confucianism said the ruler had to be good, and if he wasn't, you didn't have to follow him. He didn't like any of that biz. Some of their achievements: one law system that applied to all. A new unified money system. Instead of having different types of money throughout the whole Chinese empire, you had one currency. And he unified their writing, so everybody was now using the same system of writing. This all unites China for the first time. It's a really united country. Some of his building achievements: we know that he had the Great Wall of China constructed, many parts of it, protecting China's northern border by connecting earlier walls. Took hundreds and thousands of workers and years to complete. These are Chinese coins right here, believe it or not. This is what their currency was. Here's the writing system and the Great Wall as we see. All right. Bonus content: the Han. Okay, so we know that the Qin dynasty falls, and they were very brutal, so they didn't last very long after the death of their great emperor Shi Huangdi, and in comes the Han, and they're going to rule for about 400 years. 202, it says the 220, that remnants are around it, really about 185 or so, but you still have some remnants. It's actually going to be the early Han and the late Han. That's two different time periods, but we're just gonna focus on the one Han to make it easier to understand. Again, they get rid of legalism, they give land to the peasants, they bring back Confucius, they establish a civil service to try to promote people based on their education rather than just because they are loyal or because they are a lord. We're not going to, as Confucius say, not determine what people should do by their birth, but instead by how hard they work and how much they learn. And this system of training would be a part of China for the next 2,000 years. If you notice, the Han Empire stretches south and west and even above the Great Wall. Here's the Great Wall of China. Remember, this territory right here was about where the Qin was. The Han stretches south and into the west. We're also going to have the Silk Road here, which we're going to see in a second. It becomes one of the largest empires in the world. Its cities were believed to be some of the most beautiful ever built. As the Han grew, it came into many different cultures, contact with many different cultures. Here is India, all the way over to the Roman Empire. Here is Asia Minor, Byzantium, Persia. All of these different civilizations are now coming into contact throughout the Middle East and Europe with China. Most important trade route, one of the most important trade routes of all time, the Silk Road. Not only did goods and services, but religion crisscrossed, cultural diffusion takes place. In fact, disease is actually going to be carried along the Silk Road, and the plague is going to spread from China into the West as well. It was also a great time period for inventions. Paper was invented, the first dictionaries, crossbows, the wrench and cogs, different machines were invented, as well as new map making skills. All of this came about during the Han, and we call that a golden age, where you have great advancements. So you now have a golden age of technology, a golden age of science and math and medicine, a golden age of trade and wealth. Eventually, again, just like throughout all of Chinese history, the dynasty is going to fall and leaders begin to weaken. Groups like the Huns invade. Peasants opposed harsh taxes, which are needed to use to pay troops to defend them. And so eventually the Han falls. And then, so you have the Han ruling for 400 years, followed by a period of 400 years where China was divided and nobody ruled. And that is the end of the notes on China. If you look at the last section that I put in your review, it has the Laozi and Confucius on there. And on the back, it gets into the Tang, Song, Mongol, and Ming, but we're not going to cover those for a long time. But just briefly look over the differences between Laozi and Confucius. And we also had legalism, which I didn't put on there, but that you guys know about, with the strict laws and harsh punishments for bad behavior. All right, that's going to wrap up your review on all of the different Chinese dynasties. And you guys should be pretty well prepared for your test coming up this week.